4,217 people were standing in the grandstands at the Harlan County Fairgrounds in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, on the third Saturday of September in 2019, and the ones in the first 3 rows had a pretty clear view of what was parked at the far end of the staging lane, and most of them, if you'd asked them right then, would have told you the same thing. They would have told you that the old man standing next to the rust-colored Chevrolet C10 with the cracked windshield and the hand-lettered number on the door had made a mistake showing up. The truck was a 1968. You could tell that from 20 feet away if you knew what you were looking at, and from 40 feet away, even if you didn't, because there is a specific kind of age that settles into sheet metal, the way weathering settles into a barn board, and this truck wore that age without apology. The hood had been repainted at some point in the early 1990s. You could tell by the oxidation pattern, but the passenger door was still the original color, a shade of green that the Chevrolet catalog had called Fathom Green, but that the years had turned into something closer to the color of a creek bottom in late October. There were hand-painted numbers on both doors, white paint applied with a brush rather than a stencil, and the registration sticker on the windshield was current, which was about the most modern thing you could say about it. The total amount the man standing next to it had invested in the truck, including the purchase price, the parts, the machine work, and every consumable he'd used during the rebuild, was $3,200 and change. At the other end of the staging lane was a different kind of statement entirely. The Kenworth-sponsored pulling truck that had won 4 regional championships in the previous 18 months was painted in a 2-tone scheme of black and chrome yellow that made it look like something that had been designed in a wind tunnel, which parts of it had. The crew working around it numbered 6 people, all of them in matching shirts with the sponsor logo on the chest, all of them carrying tools that still had the factory finish on the handles. The engine alone had cost more than most of the farms represented in those grandstands. The total build cost, which the team's social media had made no effort to conceal, was $430,000. One of the crew members walked the length of the staging lane at around 11 in the morning, doing a casual inspection of the competition, the way a surgeon might walk through a waiting room. He stopped at the old C10. He looked at the hand-painted numbers. He looked at the cracked windshield. He looked at the man standing beside it, who was 71 years old, who was wearing the same Carhartt jacket he'd worn to every pull he'd attended since 1987, who did not look up from the tire he was examining when the crew member stopped. The crew member said something to the man next to him, and both of them laughed. And then they walked back toward the Kenworth, and the old man finished examining the tire and moved to the next one. His name was Delbert Crane, and I need to tell you who he was before I tell you what happened that afternoon, because if I skip that part, this is just a story about a truck, and it is not a story about a truck. Delbert Crane was born in 1948 in Harlan County, which means he was born into a specific set of conditions that shaped everything that came after. His father, Raymond Crane, had worked in the mines for 11 years before a roof fall in 1954 convinced him that the ground above a man's head was not a place to test his luck twice, and he came up out of the earth for the last time on a Thursday afternoon in March and drove home and told his wife, Edna, that he was going to farm. They had 140 acres on the eastern edge of the county, land that Raymond's father had acquired during the timber clearing years and held on to through 2 depressions and 1 war. And Raymond spent the next 4 decades proving that a man who had survived underground work could survive anything a Kentucky hillside chose to throw at him. Delbert was the second of 4 children and the only one who stayed. He stayed because of the engines. That is the simplest way to say it. The other Crane children left for Lexington and Cincinnati, and one of them made it all the way to Portland, Oregon, which in Harlan County in the 1970s was roughly equivalent to the moon. But Delbert had found, at the age of 9, that the internal combustion engine was the most interesting thing in the world, and everything interesting in his world was within about 40 miles of where he'd been born. His father had an old Farmall H that needed more attention than it received, and Delbert started working on it at 9, not because Raymond asked him to, but because he couldn't stop thinking about it. By the time he was 12, he had rebuilt the carburetor twice and had opinions about it. He married a woman named Carol Hensley in 1971, and they built a house on 20 acres of the family land that Delbert had purchased from his father for a price that was fair to both of them, and they raised 2 children there, a daughter named Lena and a son named Marcus. And Delbert farmed and did machine work for neighbors and drove a truck for a regional hauler for 11 years to make up the difference in the lean years, which in Harlan County in the 1980s were most of the years. He never sold a single parcel of land. He refinanced once, in 1986, during a stretch when the commodity prices did what commodity prices do to people who are dependent on them, and he paid that loan off 4 years early and did not refinance again. The truck came into his life in the spring of 2015. A neighbor named Herschel Potts was cleaning out a machine shed on a property he'd inherited from his uncle, and the 1968 C10 had been sitting in the back of that shed since 1991, which is to say it had been sitting there for 24 years under a canvas tarp that had given up its waterproofing qualities sometime around 1998. Herschel wanted it gone. He called Delbert because Delbert was the person you called in that county when you had something mechanical that needed to go somewhere or become something else. Delbert drove out on a Tuesday morning, pulled back the tarp, and stood there for a long moment looking at what was underneath it. He paid Herschel $400 for the truck and towed it home on a borrowed trailer that afternoon. Now, I need to stop here and explain something, because without this next part, what happened at the Harlan County Fairgrounds in September of 2019 is just a surprising result in a county-level truck pull, and it is considerably more than that. What Delbert saw under that tarp in Herschel Potts's machine shed was not a restoration project. He was not interested in restoring the truck. He was not going to sand it and paint it and put it in a show. What he saw under that tarp was a platform, a specific, carefully considered platform for an engine and drivetrain combination that he had been thinking about, in the back of his mind, for the better part of 15 years, ever since he'd watched a friend of his lose a pull at a county fair in Pulaski County in 2004 with a truck that had more horsepower than anything else in the class and still couldn't get the sled past the 200-foot marker. Here is the intellectual key to everything that happened on that strip in September of 2019, and I need you to stay with me for a few minutes, because this is the part that explains why a $3,200 truck beat a $430,000 machine in front of 4,000 people. Truck pulling, at its core, is not a test of horsepower. This is the thing that most people watching from the grandstands do not understand, and it is the thing that the team behind the Kenworth had spent $430,000 getting exactly wrong. Truck pulling is a test of torque. Specifically, it is a test of torque delivered at low RPM under maximum load against a sled that is specifically engineered to become heavier the further it travels down the strip. The sled uses a weight transfer mechanism that progressively increases the downward force on the front skid as it moves forward, which means that the first 100 feet of a pull require a certain amount of force, and the last 100 feet require dramatically more, and the force required at the end is the kind of force that most engines, even very expensive ones, cannot sustain. The difference between horsepower and torque is the difference between a racehorse and a draft horse, and I mean that precisely, not as decoration. A racehorse produces enormous power at high speed, at the top of its stride, when everything is moving fast and the conditions are favorable. A draft horse produces its force at the bottom, at the moment of maximum resistance, when the load is heaviest and the speed is lowest, and every other kind of engine would be spinning its wheels or blowing its stack. Horsepower is what an engine does at high RPM. Torque is what an engine does when the world is pushing back. The Kenworth's engine was built for horsepower. It produced somewhere north of 2,800 horsepower at peak, which is a number that sounds like an argument that cannot be answered. The crew had built it to scream, to rev hard, to spin up fast and deliver its power in a band that lived near the top of the tachometer. And, in many pulls, against many competitors, that approach worked. It worked because most competitors were also chasing horsepower, because horsepower is what sounds impressive, what photographs well, what gets sponsor attention, and what wins when the competition is also optimized for the wrong thing. What Delbert had built under the hood of that 1968 C10 was a 6.5-liter Detroit diesel that he had pulled from a decommissioned military vehicle he'd acquired through a government surplus auction in 2016 for $900, engine included. The 6.5 Detroit is not a glamorous engine. It is not an engine that people write magazine articles about. It is an engine that the United States Army had used in HMMWVs and cargo trucks because it was reliable and torquey and would run under conditions that would destroy a more refined power plant, and it had a torque curve that started low and stayed wide and flat all the way through the RPM range, which is exactly what you want when the sled is at maximum weight and you're 250 feet down the strip and every other truck in the class has already stopped. Delbert had spent 14 months modifying that engine in the machine shed behind his house, working mostly in the evenings after the farm work was done, using a snap-on toolbox that he'd bought used in 1979 and maintained ever since, and a service manual for the 6.5 that he'd found at a swap meet in Barberville for $3. He had rebuilt the injection pump for maximum fuel delivery at low RPM. He had installed a compound turbocharger setup, 2 turbos in sequence, the smaller one spooling fast to eliminate lag and the larger one building boost pressure that arrived before the engine needed it rather than after. He had rebuilt the transmission, a heavy-duty 4-speed that he'd sourced from a wrecked farm truck in Bell County for $250, and he had set the final drive ratio to keep the engine in its peak torque band for the entire length of the pull. He had not added horsepower. He had added patience. He had built an engine that was optimized for the moment when the sled was heaviest and the strip was longest, and everything that had been built for speed had already given up. Carol brought him a sandwich and a thermos of coffee on a Tuesday evening in March of 2019, 6 months before Harlan County, and set them on the workbench without saying anything, and Delbert looked up from the injection pump he was calibrating and said, "I think I've got it." And Carol said, "You've been saying that since February," and went back to the house. He had been saying it since February. He had also been right since February. He just wanted to be sure. The morning of the pull, September 21st, 2019, was cool and clear in Elizabethtown. The temperature at the fairgrounds at 9 a.m. was 54 degrees, which matters for engine performance in ways that most people standing in those grandstands would not have thought to consider. Cool, dense air carries more oxygen per cubic foot than warm air, and more oxygen means more complete combustion, which means more torque at every point in the RPM range. Delbert had checked the forecast 3 days earlier and had adjusted his injection timing accordingly. A small change, 2 degrees of advance, that would have been invisible to anyone watching, but that added approximately 40 foot-pounds of torque across the entire operating range. He had written the adjustment in a spiral notebook that he kept in the glove box of the C-10, the same notebook where he'd been recording measurements and adjustments for 4 years. There was a boy at the fence near the staging area, maybe 9 or 10 years old, in a Harlan County Middle School sweatshirt that was too big for him, and he'd been watching Delbert check the truck's tires since about 9:30 in the morning. At some point before the first pull of the day, the boy pressed his face against the chain link and said, "Mister, which one do you think's gonna win?" And Delbert looked over at the Kenworth at the other end of the lane, all chrome yellow and sponsor logos and professional crew, and then looked back at the boy and said, "Depends on what you're measuring." The boy thought about that for a moment and then said, "Distance," and Delbert said, "Then probably us," and went back to checking the tires. The Kenworth pulled third in the class. The announcer gave it the kind of introduction that announcers give to things that have won before, running through the championship history, the sponsor list, the engine specs, the crew credentials, and the crowd responded the way crowds respond to things they recognize as powerful and professional. The engine started with a sound like a sustained explosion, a deep, percussive roar that you felt in your sternum before you heard it with your ears, and the crew moved around the truck with the choreographed efficiency of people who had done this hundreds of times, which they had. The Kenworth launched hard. It was built to launch hard. The tires bit into the clay of the strip, and the truck surged forward with the kind of violent initial acceleration that makes crowds stand up, and the announcer called the distance markers as they passed. 50 feet, 100 feet, 150 feet. The engine screaming through its power band, the exhaust stacks throwing black smoke against the September sky. At 200 feet, the truck was still moving, and the crowd was on its feet, and at 220 feet, the engine note changed, climbing higher as the RPMs climbed and the sled resistance climbed with them, the two curves intersecting at the point where the engine's power band ended and the sled's weight began to win. At 241 feet, the Kenworth stopped. The chain went slack. The announcer called the distance, and the crowd responded with the kind of sustained applause that 4,000 people produce when they've seen something impressive. And the crew moved in immediately, professional and efficient, and the Kenworth came off the strip. 241 feet. That was the number. That was what Delbert needed to beat. He was 7th in the pull order. He had time to watch the 4 trucks between the Kenworth and himself, and he watched each one with the same unhurried attention he gave to everything mechanical, standing beside the C-10 with his arms folded and his eyes on the strip. None of them reached 241 feet. One of them, a heavily modified late-model Dodge with a built Cummins that had cost its owner somewhere north of $60,000, reached 227 feet before the engine climbed out of its power band and the sled won. The crowd applauded. Delbert watched the Dodge come off the strip and then walked around to the driver's side of the C-10 and put his hand flat on the hood for a moment, the way you'd put your hand on a horse's neck before a race, and then he got in. The C-10 started the way it always started, which was without drama. The 6.5 Detroit came up from cold idle to operating temperature with a sound that was lower and steadier than anything else in the class. A deep, even note that didn't have the sharp edges of the high-performance gasoline engines or the percussive violence of the Kenworth's build. It sounded like something that had been doing this for a long time and intended to keep doing it. A few people in the grandstands laughed. Not cruelly, just the way you laugh when something doesn't match your expectations, and the mismatch seems harmless. Delbert pulled the C-10 to the line and the hookup crew attached the chain to the hitch, and there was the single sharp metallic note of the chain going tight. That specific sound that exists only in that moment, when the slack becomes tension and the potential becomes something else entirely. Delbert sat in the cab with his hands on the wheel and his eyes forward and did not rev the engine. He did not build RPMs against the brake. He did not perform anything for the crowd. He sat there for a moment in the way that a man sits when he knows what he's about to do and has known it for 4 years. The flag dropped at 1:17 in the afternoon. The C-10 moved from the line the way a draft horse moves when it leans into a collar, without drama, without a sound beyond the engine note, which climbed through the low registers and stayed there, the tires finding the clay and keeping it, pressing into the surface without spinning, the weight of the truck transferring to the rear axle as the chain came taut and the sled resistance began. There was no surge, no violent initial acceleration, no black smoke. The exhaust was a pale gray, the color of complete combustion, the color of an engine that is burning every molecule of fuel it is being given. The truck moved at a walking pace, and it kept moving. At 50 feet, the crowd was quiet. This was not the kind of pull they knew how to read. There was no drama to respond to, no violence to react to, just this old truck moving down the strip at a pace that seemed almost casual, the engine note steady and low, the tires leaving clean, even tracks in the clay. At 100 feet, Delbert had not changed anything. The RPMs had not climbed. The exhaust had not darkened. The truck was moving at the same steady pace it had moved at 10 feet, which should have been impossible given that the sled was now considerably heavier than it had been at the start. The crowd was beginning to understand that something was different about this pull, even if they couldn't have told you what it was. People who had been talking to their neighbors stopped talking. At 150 feet, the boy in the Harlan County Middle School sweatshirt was standing on the bottom rail of the chain-link fence with both hands gripping the top rail and his face pointing at the C-10, and he was not saying anything. At 200 feet, the grandstands were as quiet as 4,000 people can be. The engine note had risen slightly, maybe 100 RPM, but the exhaust was still pale. The tires were still finding purchase, and the truck was still moving. This was the distance where the Dodge with the $60,000 Cummins had still been moving. This was 41 feet short of where the Kenworth had stopped. The sled was at near maximum weight. The clay at this point in the strip was darker, wetter from the previous pulls, and the resistance was higher than it had been at the start by a factor that the engineers and the Kenworth crew would have been able to calculate precisely, and that Delbert had calculated in his spiral notebook in March. At 220 feet, someone in the grandstands made a sound that wasn't a word. It was just a sound, the kind that comes out of a person when they are watching something they did not believe was possible and are having to revise their understanding in real time. The C-10 was still moving. The engine note had climbed another 100 RPM, and now there was a sound beneath the engine note, a high, steady whistle that was the compound turbocharger system working at full boost, 2 turbos in sequence building pressure that the engine was converting directly into torque at the bottom of the RPM range, where the sled was heaviest and the strip was longest, and everything else had already stopped. At 241 feet, the C-10 passed the Kenworth's mark. There was a moment of silence before the crowd found its voice, the kind of silence that happens when 4,000 people are all processing the same information at the same time, and then the grandstands came up all at once, not in a wave but simultaneously, the sound arriving like a physical thing. The announcer called the distance, and his voice had something in it that announcers work their whole careers to keep out of their voices, which was genuine surprise. The C-10 kept moving. At 260 feet, the engine note was higher still, and Delbert had his hands on the wheel and his eyes on the strip and was giving the engine what it asked for and nothing more. The tires were pressing into the clay and leaving furrows now, the weight transfer at maximum, the suspension crouched under the load, the frame doing exactly what 40 years of Kentucky roads had prepared it to do. At 270 feet, the exhaust darkened slightly, the first sign that the engine was approaching the limit of what the fuel system could support at this RPM, and the turbo whistle climbed in pitch. At 283 feet, the C-10 stopped. Not violently, not with a mechanical protest, just a gradual, dignified reduction in forward motion, the way a draft horse stops when it has given everything it has and the load has finally won, which is different from the way an engine stops when it has been asked to do something it was not built to do. 283 feet, 42 feet past the Kenworth, in a truck that had cost $3,200. The ground doesn't lie. Dirt doesn't care what something cost. It just tells you what it is. Delbert sat in the cab for a moment after the truck stopped, and then he got out and walked to the rear of the truck and looked at the tires, the same way he'd looked at them that morning, and then he crouched down and looked at the chain attachment point, and then he stood up and put his hand on the fender. The crowd was still making noise. He did not appear to notice. The crew chief from the Kenworth team came across the staging area about 10 minutes later. He was a man named Gary Pulliam, out of Bowling Green, and he had been building pulling trucks for 22 years. And he walked up to the C-10 and stood there for a moment looking at it, and then he looked at Delbert, and he said, "What have you got under there?" Delbert said, 6'5 Detroit. Gary said, "Military?" And Delbert said, "Government surplus, $900. Gary was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Compound turbos?" And Delbert said, "Small one spools fast, big one builds pressure." Gary nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is recalculating something he thought he understood. He put his hand on the hood of the C-10, in the same place Delbert had put his hand before the pull, and he stood there for a moment, and then he said, "That's a hell of a thing." And Delbert said, "It's just physics." And Gary said, "Yeah," and walked back to his truck. Lena Crane, Delbert's daughter, had driven up from Knoxville that morning. She had not told her father she was coming. She had been in the grandstands in the fourth row since 10 a.m., and she had watched the whole pull from there, and after it was over, she came down through the crowd and found her father standing beside the C-10 with a bottle of water, still not performing anything for anyone, and she put her arms around him and he said, "You drove up?" And she said, "I drove up." And that was the whole conversation, and it was enough. There is a thing worth knowing about what happened after that September afternoon. Delbert drove the C-10 home on its own power, which it had always been capable of doing, and he parked it in the machine shed behind the house, and the next morning he went out and started it and let it warm up and listened to it for a while, and then he shut it off and went in for breakfast. He entered it in 2 more pulls at fall, in Pulaski County and in Laurel County, and it won both of them. And then he put it away for the winter and went back to the farm work that had always been the main thing. He did not paint the truck. The passenger door is still fathom green going on creek bottom brown. The hand-painted numbers are still there, white paint applied with a brush. The windshield still has the crack in the lower left corner. He has been asked more than once why he doesn't at least clean it up, and his answer is always some version of the same thing, which is that the truck doesn't need to look like anything other than what it is. The spiral notebook is still in the glove box. The last entry is from September 19th, 2019, 2 days before the pull at Harlan County, and it reads, 54 degrees forecast, advanced timing 2 degrees, verify compound boost pressure at idle. That is all it says. That is all it needed to say. Gary Pulliam drove out to Harlan County in November of that year on a Saturday and spent 4 hours in Delbert's machine shed asking questions and looking at the engine. He brought his youngest crew member with him, a 23-year-old from Bowling Green named Tyler, who had grown up wanting to build pulling trucks and who spent most of those 4 hours not saying anything and looking at the injection pump with an expression that Delbert recognized, because it was the expression he'd had at 9 years old looking at his father's Farmel H. Before they left, Tyler asked Delbert how long it had taken him to understand the torque curve the way he understood it, and Delbert thought about that for a moment and said, "I'm still learning it," and Tyler nodded like that was the answer he'd been hoping for. The 6.5 Detroit is still in the C10. The compound turbo setup is still there. The spiral notebook is still in the glove box. Delbert Crane is 76 years old as of this telling, and he still farms the land that his grandfather acquired and his father held on to, and that he has never sold a single parcel of, and he still does machine work for neighbors, and the C10 still starts on the first try every time he turns the key, which is not an accident. If you know a story like this one, I want to hear it. Not the kind of story where someone bought something expensive and it worked the way expensive things are supposed to work, but the kind where someone understood something deeply enough that the money stopped mattering, where the quiet work in a machine shed on a Tuesday evening turned out to be the thing that lasted. Drop it in the comments. I read every one of them, and I mean that without qualification, because the stories that come through this community are the reason I keep making these. If this one hit you the way it hit the people standing in those grandstands, there is a subscribe button on this channel, and what it connects you to is a place where stories like Delbert's get told every week. Stories about people who did the work before anyone was watching, who understood the thing before anyone asked them to prove it, who kept the notebook in the glove box and adjusted the timing 2 degrees and showed up at the fairgrounds on a cool September morning and let the dirt do the talking. Pass this one on to someone who needs it. Not everyone who needs a story like this one knows they need it, and the only way these things survive is if somebody decides they're worth carrying forward. That's all this has ever been. One person deciding a story is worth passing on, and then another person making the same decision all the way down the line until it reaches somebody standing in the right machine shed at the right moment, looking at something under a tarp and thinking, "I know what this could be." The C10 is still in the shed. The engine is still ticking cool in the Kentucky dark. And somewhere in the glove box, in a spiral notebook with a cracked cover, there's a line of handwriting that says advanced timing 2 degrees. And that is the whole story, and it is enough.